John Wick Chapter 2 delivered on Winston's promise that something from the pond would grab John and drag him deep. The ending of the movie, John excommunicated and his life forfeit with a $14 million bounty on his head, made it clear the world of death has a strong grip, and like quicksand, the more you struggle, the deeper you sink. But if John stops fighting, he dies. So in his search for peace, he has no choice but to prepare for war. Parabellum. Chapter 3 is odd in some ways. The first and second were very connected, but also had self-contained arcs with their own conclusions. Yosef dead at the end of one, and Santino dead at the end of the other. But Chapter 3 really just continues proving the point, there is no escape. The more John fights, the more he has to fight. The movie follows his attempts to break out, but things end where they began. John is still marked for death by the High Table, he's still excommunicado, even the bounty on his head remains at the same $14 million it started with. But if you have to watch any character tread water, you really can't do better than John Wick. Because this movie proves that 1 and 2 only showed us the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his talents and capabilities. And although the status quo remains mostly the same by the end, some other things do change. But first, like a musical, Chapter 3 begins with a 25-minute medley, sampling the best of Wick. We see him finish his own stitches, quickly assemble a functional gun from antiques just in time to shoot the bad guys, and we rapidly move through different environments, each enabling new techniques and weapons. There's death by book at the New York Public Library, when John faces a 7'4" assassin, then the antique store, death by throwing knives and axes. Finally, death by horse and horse versus motorcycles. Chapter 3 leans more into the absurdity of the Wickverse than either previous entry, but still takes itself seriously, with a few exceptions.
That was a pretty good fight, huh?
Yeah.
Mileage will vary on the humor and sheer insanity of it all, but I don't think anyone can deny those first 25 minutes as some of the best this series has to offer. And over the next 2 hours, as John struggles to find peace, the movie continues expanding the world. There's the Casablanca Continental, the Adjudicator, the location where the coins are minted, the Elder, and even a glimpse at John's origins, which doubles as a tease for that upcoming spin-off. We also see what the High Table has at its disposal, including head-to-toe armor, which makes John versus dozens of enemies a little closer to even odds. But as the world expands and John's enemies become more formidable, he is forced to rely more on the loyalty of friends. In Chapter 2, there was already a growing tension between rules and loyalty. John had no personal interest in killing Gianna, but the rules dictated he must. Winston sees John as an old friend, but spilling blood on continental grounds dictates that he has to die. Chapter 3 grows those tensions by showing just how powerful the rules are. In the movie's opening minutes, John visits a doctor. He tries to treat John's wound in the seconds before his excommunicado begins, and when the hour is up, he stops promptly. There are no witnesses, so it's hard to imagine how the High Table would possibly know he helped John after the hour, but his strict adherence shows a belief almost bordering on religious fervor. After John finishes the stitches, the doctor tells him where to find the right medicine, because he wouldn't dare help John by grabbing it himself. But even just telling John where to find the medicine is a step too far. So he asks John to shoot him a couple of times to make it seem like he was under duress. That is the power of the High Table. That is the fear they've instilled. The message is clear, and it's no mistake the movie starts with this message because it permeates the rest of the runtime. Breaking or even bending rules in this world has consequences. This adds weight to everyone's choices and real meaning to their friendships. That's true for the actions they take in this movie, and retroactively for the actions they took in the previous movie. The Bowery King gave John 7 rounds in Chapter 2, he gets 7 cuts in Chapter 3. Winston gave John a 1-hour head start rather than kill him on the spot, He is relieved of his duties as head of the New York Continental. Each favor given John is another testament to the importance of friendship, how time and time again his having helped and shown respect to others comes back to save him, proving karma is a force that can exist with or without a spiritual mechanism. It lives in the reciprocity built into basic human nature. As the walls close in on John, he visits the director. We learn his true name,
Jovanovich.
and that he was a child of the Belarus, an orphan of her tribe. It seems this is where John was raised and trained, and it seems appropriate ballet be brought into this franchise, as both are testaments to what the human body is capable of. But John isn't there for a trip down memory lane. He's come home to collect on another favor, passage to Casablanca so he can find the Elder, he who sits above the high table, the only one who can free John from his deadly fate. The director knows what we know, rules and consequences. Her group, the Ruska Roma, are bound by the high table like anyone else. Helping John will be met with punishment. So before giving John what he believes he's owed, she reminds him that she always dissuades her students from the notion of a life free from suffering.
Art is pain. Life is suffering.
In his interview with Slash Film, director Chad Stahelski said this line was his inner Nietzsche coming out. His philosophy is obviously complicated and too big to unpack in this video, but I'll cherry pick one little sliver of it here. When we think of suffering, our inclination might be to run instead toward comfort. But one of Nietzsche's views was that suffering should be embraced as a means of becoming stronger and more resilient. And after watching John Wick, who doesn't feel some part of them hoping to be tested? The fight choreography and amazing set pieces are a necessary part of this franchise. But the thing it celebrates at its core is resilience and willpower. That's the engine behind the action, which makes John Wick an icon. One more on the list of heroes you can think of when you're trying to run one more mile, get in one last rep, or just keep going when life really sucks. Angelica Houston's character essentially reminds John not to take his suffering for granted, but then does offer the help he seeks. And like everyone else, she accepts the consequences. In her case, a blade through her helping hands. In Casablanca, John cashes in yet another favor, and those who prefer the lone wolf might find this movie frustrating because it leans so heavily on John's need for allies. But this does serve to highlight that theme of consequences. Friendship is easy when there's nothing on the line, but Chapter 3 tests loyalties by adding weight to the choice between John and the high table. And in each case, Winston, Sharon, the doctor, and the director, they show how even if you believe in a system and respect its rules, sometimes you will have to choose between it and your ideals. You might think of that as an ethical dilemma, or you might pragmatically think of it as knowing the consequences and deciding whether or not you're willing to pay the price. Or when the system turns against you, how hard you're willing to fight back. Next up on John's list of favors is Sophia. Ironically, after Chapter 2, John is now in the Santino role. Now he's the one presenting a marker, asking Sophia to make good on a promise against her wishes. Though there's a clear difference between the two. Santino had a purely selfish motive, power, and he was asking John to kill someone he knew. John's motive, on the other hand, is just about survival, and all he wants is for her to help him find the Elder. Of course, nothing is ever that easy, so after learning from Barada how to meet the Elder, John and Sophia have to fight their way out, with help from her 2 dogs, finally letting canines get in on the action. To reach the Elder, John is forced to walk through the desert until he's almost dead, then keep walking. When he's on his last breath, the Elder will decide whether or not to pick him up for a meeting. Thankfully for John, the Elder lets him live. And on the razor's edge between life and death, where John must be sure what he's fighting for, the Elder asks the question you might have been asking yourself in Chapter 2. Why do you wish to live? And John answers,
My wife, Helen, to remember her, to remember us.
You can read his answer with a tinge of spirituality, or take it as entirely literal. He already lost Helen once, and what's left of her now lives on in his memory. If he were to die, he would know in those dying moments that he's letting that last part of her die too. So he has to hold on to it, and to do that, he has to live. But it's not that simple. The elder tells him what it'll cost for his excommunicado to be reversed. John will have to rededicate himself to the high table and do their bidding for the rest of his days. And his first task is to kill Winston. John accepts the price, and at the elder's demand, shows his fealty by severing his ring finger, then hand over his ring. A way to show what John is willing to give up at the altar of the high table. When John returns to the Continental, Winston knows why he's there and makes John realize staying alive at any cost may not be the answer. Yes, John could kill his friend and live, but what kind of life would that be? Winston asks him, "Who do you wish to die as? The Baba Yaga? The last thing many men ever see? Or as a man who loved and was loved by his wife?"
Who do you wish to die as, Jonathan?
Identity can refer to many things. There's the person you see yourself as, the person you wish to be, and most importantly, who you are as defined by your actions. To fully honor the memory of Helen and to be at peace, John needs to be the man she loved, not a monster who kills at the high table's command. That would mean living the rest of his life wearing an identity completely at odds with his ideals. It's not something that would feel very peaceful. In the face of that, struggling against the high table in the faint hope of finding peace does more to respect Helen. Even if it gets John killed, he'll at least experience those final moments as John Wick, the man Helen loved, as opposed to a lifetime as the Baba Yaga. When Winston puts it like that, the choice is obvious. And now we're out of accept the consequences and pay the price territory. Now we're in the system has turned against you, prepare for war territory. Parabellum. Winston refuses to step down from his position and instead grabs a gun. Well, he grabs a glass of wine, but he gives John and Sharon some guns. And cue the big fight scene. One of my favorite moments in all this, by the way, is when the adjudicator calls Winston to basically tell him he can't win. And mid-sentence, he hangs up on her.
I know you believe you can keep this up, but I assure you...
I never realized how badass it was to hang up on someone, like John hanging up on Santino in Chapter 2, when Santino called to let John know he was putting a hit on him. Now we see where John got it from. It's badass and in line with the theme of acceptance. Characters in these movies know the price and consequences of their actions. Once that's accepted, there's nothing more to talk about and no time to waste. At that point, it's about taking action, or letting your friends take action. Eventually, the movie reaches a parlay. The adjudicator allows Winston to keep his post if he kills Wick. And in a movie all about John's friends coming to his aid at deep personal cost, of course that's the note it ends on too. Winston does shoot John, but in a way that gives him a fighting chance. And after tumbling into an alley, the Bowery King collects Wick and brings him underground to recuperate. In the end, John's station has not changed much from the start of the movie, and even around him, the status quo remains largely the same. The Continental was deconsecrated, and Winston was told to step down. But after the parlay, both are reversed. What has changed are some attitudes and goals. The Bowery King is mad, and less willing to cooperate with the high table. Good news for John. And John has slightly revised his goals. It's no longer about living no matter the cost. Now it's about living or dying on his terms, as the man Helen loved, and as the man who loved Helen. That's the only path to peace, whether it lasts a lifetime or just a fleeting moment. That is what John Wick is fighting for. And when John has something to fight for, we all know what happens. Focus, commitment, and sheer will. Speaking of which, if you appreciate the commitment it takes to make these videos and want to throw some support our way, plus get access to exclusive content, check out our Patreon. There's a link in the description and in a pinned comment. Also, what John Wick Chapter 4 is really about is on its way, so make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to keep up. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.